Hey everyone, Dr. Pedram Shojai back with Dr. Sara Gottfried at the Health Bridge. Hi Sara.
Hi Pedram. Hello everyone.
Hey, so today, food addiction. It's a thing, and we want to kind of peel back some of these layers here and talk about some of the biological and physiological food addiction issues, and then, you know, if we got time, we'll break into the psychological, but that's not necessarily where a lot of our dialogue is going to start, because for us, man, it feels like we've been on this topic around and around and around. It must be something that keeps coming up because it's important, is the gut biome and the psychology of the addiction and sugar and food intolerances and all this kind of stuff that are also part of the physiology of food addiction. And I don't know if too many people know about the Gluto-morphins and the Caso-morphins and what happens there. So how about we start there?
I definitely want to start there. I want to say first, though, that when I talk about food addiction with women, an interesting thing happens. Sometimes women don't want to claim it because they're ashamed, or they just feel like this idea of being addicted to food feels ridiculous because they have to eat 3 times a day. And I just want to ask our listeners here at the beginning to have an open mind about the possibility of how food might be hooking you, that you might be eating for a state change. You might be emotionally eating. All of these kind of fit under the full spectrum of food addiction. But I like this idea of going to the biology first and talking about the gluto-morphins and the Caso-morphins.
Yeah, so I think we need to call in Mark Rosen and Mark David and Emily Rosen here.
We're going to call in their spirits.
We're calling their spirits. We're going to channel them through, because the psychology of eating is one of like the coolest institutes out there, because they're really working with people on this topic, and we'll go there. But right now, let's start with the basics, which is bread and cheese. And when I say bread and cheese, I think of America, because pizza, shows up on everyone's doorstep at least once a week, it seems. And, bread and cheese, if you have bad gut colonies working, if you have leaky gut, if you have one of the myriad ways of setting up an imbalance in your gut where you're not breaking down the gluten or the casein molecules effectively, what we've found is that the derivatives of the improper breakdown, and by that I mean the gut bacteria aren't there to help, and all of the different factors that we've talked about in multiple shows aren't there to help break down those molecules. They become molecules. So the gluten becomes a gluto or gluteomorphin molecule, and caso-morphin molecules, and those morphine-like derivatives bind to the same sites, the receptor sites in the brain, morphine, addiction. And so people, I can't tell you how many people I've had in my clinic say, I can't give up cheese, I live by cheese. Cheese is, and as soon as I hear that, it perks me up, because I'm like, aha, food addiction. Oh,
it's
real
so true.
Food addiction.
It's so true. And, pizza is such a good example. I think, a lot of folks are getting the message about staying away from gluten, don't eat the pizza. It's not, that's kind of the opposite of how you should be eating. We want you having a pound of vegetables each day, etc. But there's, I can speak to this. I can say that I'm thinking about a friend of mine who has a Hanukkah party every year. She's got like this really nice Hanukkah party, and she invites a lot of people. She, Jewish and non-Jewish. And she always, every year, has this amazing cheese plate. She's gluten-free, so she's got the gluten-free crackers, maybe some gluten-free bread, and then amazing cheeses, usually from Cowgirl Creamery, a local creamery that we like. And I can kind of count back to all these Hanukkah parties that I've gone to over the past decade. And when I first started going, you could find me at the cheese plate. Like, I was kind of pounding the cheese because I really liked the taste. And I think it was all about this morphine-like effect of the cheese that I was eating.
Oh, people, the way they talk about cheese, right? I mean, you can just hear it in the way they're talking about it. It's just like their fix, right? And I'm not here saying that cheese is the devil, right? I don't think Sara and I take that stance on most things, right? Monsanto might be, but the rest of it, everything else is... Everything else is, you know, in the gray, right? But what happens is if your gut can't break down the cheese and you end up getting these caso-morphin molecules that are binding the receptor, the morphine receptors, and it upregulates, right? You want more and more and more, right? It's heroin. And so if that is happening, then it becomes a really big deal. I gotta throw a shout out to Natasha Campbell McBride, book called Gut and Psychology Syndrome. Really, really powerful. We should actually call her and get her on the show. Really powerful, looking at ADD, ADHD, all sorts of problems that happen when you have gut disorders. And she jumps into this. She's, you know, gosh, I read her book years ago, and there's tons of really good work on the subject. But it's a big deal. It's a literal addiction to food, and so, you know, what do we do about it? I'll start with you. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, you know, a couple things. I mean, sometimes you just got to get off of it. You got to do an elimination diet, and then you can try. We've talked about this before: elimination provocation, and see what your response is. I want to make this a little more personal and just say that about 4 years ago, I did a leaky gut test, and I didn't have leaky gut, but what I found was that I had an intolerance to casein and to gluten. And it was pretty, you know, I'd already been off of gluten, so that wasn't a big deal to get off of the gluten, but I had this little process that happened in my head of, oh, do I really believe that? Do I have to get off of the casein? I really like my yogurt in the morning. Do I have to give up cheese for the rest of my life? You know, I had this whole kind of addictive side that was arguing with me about whether to do it. And this is the kind of voice that we want you to attune to, you know, kind of the rationalizing inner saboteur. And for me, what I really saw as I observed myself go through this argument is that we have to want the things that are good for us, and not eat the things that are, you know, trying to soothe some emotional need that we have. And that was a defining moment for me, because I realized, okay, I've got objective data showing me that gluten and dairy are bad. I need to cut them out. And so I did. I developed this whole program to give up dairy and gluten and then to add it back in. And then when I added it back in, what I found was I gained like 3-4 pounds within a couple of days of adding the casein back in, the dairy back in. And that is a clear sign that I was increasing inflammation. I was getting more fluid retention in my body, because that's the only thing I added back in. And then I observed for 3 to 4 days. So I think elimination provocation is a really important part of this. But we also need to talk about some of these habits, some of these mindset issues that I think come up around food addiction.
Yeah, and it's tough, because I will treat food addiction the same way I will treat cigarette addiction and drug addiction in some ways, right? It's not as taboo, but the neurophysiology is pretty much the same. I mean, it's a chemical addiction to a substance, and people will debate it all the time. I mean, I had a patient come in. I was actually in the clinic yesterday. I had a patient come in a couple weeks ago, and we ran some labs, and she messed up on her labs, so we didn't have the results. But, you know, I said, okay, so how'd you do on your diet? I just told her 2 things. I said, you need to eat more protein, and you need to cut all dairy, right? And that's your homework. And we talked about this with the Mike Lovett show, is like, you know, giving them homework and saying, what are you going to do? And she's like, oh, yeah, you know, I didn't think that stuff was important. You know, what, you know, and so I just stopped and stood up and said, what do you do for a living? I'm a dance instructor. Okay, so if we did a dance lesson and you said, okay, here's the 5 moves that you need to learn by next week, and then I came back next week and you said, okay, let me see them, and I said, oh, I didn't practice that, I didn't think it was important, how would you feel? She's like, well, no, that's one of my pet peeves. I'm like, okay, so if you ever want me to be your doctor, you do as I say, or I just can't help you, right? It was one of those like weird, like I don't want to be ineffective in life, but I need you to stop right now and realize that you agreed to this, and then you just walked off and caught yourself smoking and didn't even think about it. It's like they will not let it go. And I had that with Alan Christensen, right? I was like, oh, I'm fine. I don't have any dairy issues, right? And then we get my blood work back, and I was like, nope, dairy from cows, Pedram. Cut it out completely. I've dropped, what, 15 pounds?
Yeah.
Right? And I was eating well. I was eating well. I was doing everything else right. I dropped 15 pounds, right? And so, of course, I'm exercising, doing these other things as well, but it was that pronounced when you finally give your body an opportunity to not be stuck in that really bad, vicious cycle of addiction. And it's not just with gluten and casein. I mean, we had Mark Hyman on the show. He talked about sugar addiction and how it's 10 times more addictive than cocaine. That's no joke, right?
It's no joke. It's totally true. And I feel like that patient you're talking about who came back into the office and didn't give up the dairy, when I hear that, I just think that's the addict talking. Like I've developed an ear to hear it, but I think, I really challenge our listeners to maybe start hearing those voices, kind of the rationalization, oh, I don't need to do it, or I'll just give up the cow dairy. I'm not going to give up the goat and the sheep and the other dairy that I'm eating. I think it's really important to realize that your addict is constantly going to be throwing these obstacles in your way. And I also want to, there's some interesting work now. For a while, I would say food addiction didn't get the kind of scientific attention that it deserved. And fortunately, that's really changed. At Yale, for instance, there's a group that developed the Yale Food Addiction Scale, which is a validated scale. I want to throw out some questions that are from it in a moment. And also at Harvard, there's some people who are doing some really important food addiction work. It's not just in those places, of course, it's all over the world that we're studying this. But I just want to share some of these questions so that you as our listener can maybe access this part of yourself and see if this comes up for you. Does that work for you, Pedram?
I love it.
Okay, so these are my version of the Yale Food Addiction Scale, and we're going to be making a quiz out of this for the next book. So do you have or have you experienced in the past 6 months looking in the mirror and not liking what you see? Limiting yourself to certain activities until you finally lose the weight, such as sex or going to the beach? Eating or craving certain foods even when you're not hungry? Snacking all day long, maybe to keep up your energy? Noticing that your weight seems to fluctuate constantly and maybe even that you gain weight aggressively? Jumping from one diet to another looking for the magic bullet? Feeling tired or sluggish after eating? Hiding food or eating in secrecy? Maybe you have a secret stash of chocolate in your desk. Eating more than you planned or binging? Purging? Overeating? So this is just a small sampler, but I feel like it captures some of that spectrum that we're talking about when it comes to food addiction.
We had a friend over last week, and he had his girlfriend with him, and vegan and super strict about her food, which I respect totally, right? And then someone had brought in a non-gluten, non-dairy pumpkin pie, which to me is just like, holy crap, that's the best thing I've ever heard of, right? Like I get to have my pie and eat it too, and so I brought it out. I was like, hey, have some shit. Oh no thanks, right? And we turn around, we're doing something else, and out of the corner of my eye, I see her in the kitchen just working this pumpkin pie, right? Like her storefront, her external personality has to say no to that because she's not someone who would eat pumpkin pie. And then as soon as no one was looking, she just dove into the thing. And I just looked at her going, food addiction, food, yeah. real food, eating disorder, right? And it's so prevalent. This is a high functioning person, right? And it's so prevalent that it needs to be brought out into the open, because yes, there's the chemical addiction, but there's also the psychological addiction, the self-image and the body image and all these types of things that your quiz just pulled out, right? Is who am I in relationship to food, and what does food do for me? And asking those bigger questions. Because, food used to be, it's like, wow, we have food, we get to live, right? And that conversation's dramatically changed as there's been more and more access to food. And so it's become a really complicated topic.
It is a complicated topic. I feel like maybe we should do a whole series on food addiction, because we haven't even touched upon processed food and how big food, just like big tobacco, big chemistry, big food has really changed the kind of food that we're eating. Our great-grandparents would never recognize a lot of the food that we're eating. And they are specifically designed, these foods, to make us addicted. They're hyper-palatable, and there's thousands of biochemists that are trying to make these foods more addictive to us. So some of this is just the food industry and its influence on us, but it comes back to, I think, a really important point of your new book or your new movie, Origins, Pedram, about, kind of reclaiming that personal power that we have to eat whole foods, to avoid the processed foods, to, as you listen to us and you wonder if you have some of this food addiction, to cut out the gluten and the dairy, kind of the two biggest culprits, and then to see how your body responds, because it all comes down to kind of that attunement of what's true for your body. Here's what's true in a population. Yeah, gluten and dairy are the two most common food intolerances, and they have these morphine-like properties, but it also comes down to what's true for you.
Yeah, and there's a couple ways to do this, right? Like, I love Cyrex labs. I mean, there's some really complicated, wonderful arrays that you can do to really figure out where your food addictions are. Oh my God, I have some results on a couple patients that were sent to me that people were having trouble helping. And, they'd developed autoimmunity to their own muscles, to their own brain cells, and all these things. And it all kind of started with gluten intolerance that just went out of control. And so now, we got our work cut out for us with these patients. And so one of the things I can say is, look, yeah, we can do, you could put $1,400 into this battery of tests and we can know a lot more about what's going on. But I can tell you right now that 70% of the people that come into the clinic, if I just put them on an elimination provocation diet and say, okay, we're going to take out the gluten, we're going to take out the dairy, we're going to take out the sugar, alcohol, coffee, and, just the bigs. Right? We take out the big bad ones. And if you're listening to this and you want to just start, I would say if you could take out all gluten, bread, so wheat, oats, God, what are the gluten ones? Sorry, it's been a long morning already.
Barley, wheat berries,
and rye is not on there, but you gotta watch out rye is on there as well. So all of the things that have gluten, basically cut out the bread. And, if you want to get things that are gluten-free, that's fine. But I would just avoid grains for 3 weeks and avoid all dairy products for 3 weeks, okay? And then slowly take a little bit, not both at the same time. Don't go have a cheese pizza, because then you don't know which one's screwing you up. Then start having, a little bit back. 3 weeks from now, just add it back and see how your body reacts. It's the cheapest, most effective way to really get in and figure some of this stuff out. Without having to put in a ton of money into a battery of tests, which, I'm a big fan of. Sarah and I geek out on tests all the time, but, we've been trained to order them, and we're, within a system where it costs a lot of money to do all that. People need to make a living and labs cost money and all that, but a lot of people are like, I can't afford any of that crap. So elimination provocation is a wonderful way to kind of just figure out what your body's telling you, because if you go back and have a glass of milk and feel like you're about to die, what is that telling you? What is your body telling you? And what are you going to do to change the trajectory of how you eat based on that information? So it really brings awareness back into eating.
It brings awareness back in, and I would love to kind of end on a point about elimination provocation. So there's the actual doing of the elimination provocation. You get off of grains, get off of dairy for 3 weeks. And then you add it back in and you observe your response one at a time. You eat your challenge food, like ideally at the same time each day, just once a day, and you see what happens. If you can't do it, if you're resonating with some of these symptoms of food addiction and you can't give up the dairy and the gluten for 3 weeks, then I would say that's maybe a diagnostic test for you, that there's something bigger at play. There's some addictive qualities that are getting in the way of you being able to carry out a simple elimination diet. I know it's challenging in a busy life to do an elimination diet, but if you can't do it, I think there's often food addiction that's getting in the way. So I just wanted to add that piece of kind of the diagnostic test of being able to pull off the elimination provocation.
Yeah, and I think we could do a whole other show on how to break addictions. I mean, I love using 5-HTP, I love neurofeedback, I love exercise. There's a lot of things that you can do to challenge the system, kind of break it out of some of the kind of dominant pathways that are leading to the circuitry. It's like, and the more you do it, with every piece of cheese that you eat, you're just laying more and more pipe towards that addiction. And so how do you move in the other direction, and how do you reinforce other pathways that are not taking you down that road? And we should probably get Daniel Amen on the show to talk about some of that as well, and bring on Mark David and Psychology of Eating. So, as we're talking about this, I'm thinking of all the guests that we should have on to talk about. I think this is such an important topic. If you think it's an important topic, Facebook.com/thehealthbridge. Let us know, and we'll start making some calls and getting some more guests on to talk about this. What do you think, Sarah?
Love it. Yeah, let us know on Facebook. We are here for you. We thank you so much for listening. This has been just a really rich, important topic. So I'm glad we're taking it on, Pedram.
Love it. Yeah, and you guys use us. We collectively, we have a pretty cool Rolodex of people we can call onto the show. So let us know, and we'll have the team start calling them up, and we can get these answers for you. Just let us know what you want to know.
Thanks everybody for joining us today. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys.